In India, knowing English in the beginning was to belong to the ruling caste. There were the British, and then there were the Indians who knew English and who aped British ways in other manner as well. Now that the British are gone, English still continues to be the language of administration, the language of power every which way. In the 19th century, as we discovered English literature and all Western literature through English translation, there was a tremendous amount of excitement, a sense of discovery. And that, I believed, was very good because it wasn't very widespread. There were only a few university men at that time. They were gifted in every which way. And they then devised a kind of a novel in India, which is not quite the Western novel, not even now. And Western critics and Westernized Indian critics feel very unhappy with it. Why is it not a good novel, a well-made novel? But I think the explanation for that is that we devised something that was a bit of a hybrid between Indian storytelling and the Western genre of the novel. So there was cross-fertilization. And a number of philosophers, apart from poets and other writers, picked it up. And they played around with ideas of rebirth, for example, of the world being an illusion, of the world being created again and again, not just once, creation followed by destruction, and creation again and destruction again, which are all Hindu ideas coming out of the Bhagavad Gita, coming to be known in the West for the very first time. And Byron sharing in that excitement, disseminating those ideas, playing around with those ideas in Don Juan. What a curious way the whole thing is of clothing souls in clay. Clay is, of course, what we are made of, dust returning to dust. That's Christian. But clothing souls is very Hindu. As the British Raj here grew stronger and more entrenched and to some extent more arrogant culturally, there was a devaluation of our own culture and our own literature, which we shared in through this kind of cultural hegemony. And a number of us began to feel that the best literature in the world was English literature, or at least so indifferent. Their exposure to international English now is much greater, through television largely, through films, through international print media, which are now everywhere. I mean, Time and Newsweek sells far more now in India than it did before. So they are a bit more in the mainstream of English idiom and usage than they used to be earlier. Earlier, Indian English was mocked by writers like Kipling, even E.M. Foster, as being Babu English, being fusty, being archaic, being incorrect. During colonial times, somehow the idea was propagated by the British policymakers that the best way to learn the English language was to learn by heart huge chunks of Shakespeare and Milton, as if anybody ever spoke like that, even in England. So there was a kind of unreality to learning the English language. And then, when we had learned our English, contemporary English, English of daily use through Shakespeare and Milton, then the British blamed us for being archaic. Now one doesn't hear that very much. Also because English itself has loosened up a bit. There's more flexibility, there's more variety in it. Standard British English is no longer the model. Americans have always had more variety. They've also perhaps been a bit more slack about use of language, encouraging that kind of flexibility and variety elsewhere. English is here to stay. English is going to get stronger. But I only hope that some kind of a balance could be found between the vast majority of people who are still not privileged through knowing English, that the gap between those who know English and those who do not does not get wider and more disabling for the poor.